Welcome to Redacted Tonight VIP. I'm Lee Camp. I have a truly incredible show for you today. I spoke recently with Peter Janney, an investigator and author who has uncovered the truth about the assassination of John F. Kennedy's mistress, Mary Meyer. And perhaps not coincidentally, Peter Janney's father was also a high-ranking CIA official named Wister Janney. If you haven't heard of Mary Pinchot Meyer, it's now accepted fact that she and JFK were lovers in the final year of his life, if not before that time. And then after his murder, Mary Meyer, who was herself, she was an elite in Washington society. She was the ex-wife of a powerful CIA official. She was furious after his assassination that the truth was not getting out about the real people who killed John F. Kennedy. When it became clear that she was not going to stop speaking out, she was executed in broad daylight on the Canal Path right here in Washington, D.C. in 1964. Through decades of painstaking research, Peter Janney has unearthed the truth, and it's as horrifying as you can imagine. He's put it all together in the book Mary's Mosaic, the CIA conspiracy to murder John F. Kennedy, Mary Pinchot Meyer, and their vision for world peace. So I think you'll quickly see why I had to speak to him for the entire half hour. Here's my conversation with author Peter Janney. Hello, Dr. Janney, is it? Doctor?
Call me Peter.
All right, Peter, thank you so much for being here. Your book is incredible, clearly decades of work. And I want to try and dive into some of this. I think I want to go in with the assumption that most people know very little of the backstory of any of this because, I had known growing up, heard rumors of, JFK had some lovers and, maybe one of them had been killed in D.C., but I, really didn't know the details. So let's start with who Mary Meyer was and how you knew her personally, actually.
Well, she was a fascinating human being and an even more fascinating woman from my point of view. And of course, when I knew her as a young boy, she was my best friend's mother. And she and my mother had gone to college together. Her husband, Cord Meyer, and my father both worked at the Central Intelligence Agency together. And Michael and I were just the best of friends. And so when Michael was killed, he was hit by a car one evening right before Christmas in the late 1950s.
You were 9 or something?
Yeah, I was 9. We were both 9. And it was a very traumatic event in my life.
Of course. And
the loss really put me into what you would call an acute adjustment reaction. And my own parents were just mostly inept in terms of helping me deal with the grief around this. But who wasn't inept was Mary. And she was very, very helpful to me in terms of just holding me, and not just physically, but spiritually, emotionally during that time. And I really was just, I think, kind of saved by her in terms of her intervention. Mary was not a drinker like most of her social set. Not that she didn't have a little bit of wine, maybe a Dubonnet here and there, but she was a very avid physically tennis player, walker, camper. And I don't think she got into this sort of alcoholic rut that a lot of, Washington socialites get into.
Well, also, she probably didn't have the guilt to deal with that maybe her husband and some others had at the CIA. So ultimately, she divorces Cord Meyer, so she doesn't have a CIA husband anymore. She had known JFK for years and years, ends up having an affair with him, and he had had many affairs, but this seemed far more serious. And, it's not a rumor. Many people have come forward and said this is a fact. And she was kind of pushing him on a path toward a peaceful world, which he had taken many steps, and I think nowadays it's been lost to history, maybe intentionally, those steps he was taking. So do you want to go through some of those?
Well, I think, the pivotal event was the Cuban Missile Crisis, fall of October 1962, where we really, as a country, as a planet, came the closest we have ever come to like nuclear Armageddon. And JFK and his brother were, instrumental in pulling us out of that crisis.
Right.
But,
and not invading Cuba.
But, there was a huge opportunity in that crisis because JFK and Khrushchev really started to become friends afterwards. And
in back channels, secretly, right?
Secretly,
yeah.
Right. And so I think at that point, President Kennedy realized that this Cold War mentality is a dead-end street. And with Mary was always on him saying, Jack, you've got to open up to something much, much bigger in terms of what you want your real legacy to be about. Mm-hmm. And I think Mary's influence around world peace really started to have an increasing impact on him. But so did Khrushchev. And this was when the possibility of our country and Russia was really becoming, very close to being friends. Mm-hmm. I mean, right before JFK was assassinated in November, he gave a speech at the United Nations. And basically, he told the people at the United Nations that we were going to the moon, Russia and the US were going to go to the moon together, that this was going to be a joint effort. It was the ultimate symbol of the end of the Cold War.
So he's pushing for the end of the Cold War. You've got the nuclear test ban treaty. You've got him wanting to get out of Vietnam. We didn't have boots on the ground there yet, but he wanted to be done with it.
Right.
And he was butting heads endlessly with the CIA, and basically saying he wanted to, I don't know about disband, but greatly decrease their power. And so it's a lot of things that made him the military intelligence complex was not happy with JFK in many ways. And it seems, or I think it's pretty proven now that they had connections to his assassination. So he's assassinated, and then within a year, almost a year later, Mary Meyer is killed by 2 gunshot wounds on a towpath here in D.C. in broad daylight while she's walking. And I was wondering if you can go through kind of the details of who they said initially killed her and how she was killed on the towpath.
So this was fast forward about 10 months later, in October of 1964. Mary has read the Warren Commission report. She realizes that this is turning into the biggest cover-up this country has ever seen. And so she is contemplating going public with what she knows, particularly what she has discovered in the last year in terms of what really had gone on in Dallas. And she was...
And talking to some powerful people. I mean, she had a lot of powerful friends.
She had a lot of powerful friends, and she had a lot of insider friends who knew what was really taking place. And so she takes her daily walks on the towpath after she paints in the morning. She's an aspiring artist, really coming into her own. And so that's when it was set up to take her out, because she was on the verge of going public with who she was in JFK's life, as well as what she had discovered in terms of the media now taking control and convincing the public that Lee Harvey Oswald had alone been the crazy man who shot JFK. Mm-hmm. And she just knew it wasn't true, and that she really felt the public needed to know. And had that happened, people would have really, I think, been very upset to hear this story, because she was not a frivolous human being. This was a very substantial woman who was highly educated. So they pinned it on a guy. His name was Ray Crump, or they attempted to pin it on a guy who was down in the towpath area that day.
A 25-year-old black man who just happened to be down there, and there's at first there's only one eyewitness who does not say he saw this man. He just says he saw a black man who was wearing certain items of clothing.
And following her, allegedly. Yeah.
Right. And so there's this one eyewitness who said he can't identify the person. Oh, and gives a completely different size for the man that was, much taller, much wider. And then suddenly a second witness shows up the following day who's a lieutenant in the military and didn't say he saw the murder, but said he saw Ray Crump following Mary Meyer.
Right.
And then there's a trial, and believe it or not, the state fails to prove it, and he's found not guilty.
Right. Well, that's because of this legendary female black woman attorney, one of the first who passed the bar in the D.C. area. Her name was Dovey Roundtree. There's a movie currently being made about her, and the book that's been written about her by a very good friend of mine by the name of Katie McCabe, called Mighty Justice. And Dovey Roundtree became a legend in Washington legal circles for having gotten Ray Crump acquitted, because she showed the court that where's the evidence?
Right.
You don't have a gun. There isn't any chemical evidence linking Ray Crump to the murder scene.
There's no blood on him.
Right.
He's a completely different size than the eyewitness says. And he's got no motivation other than they claim he just spontaneously decided to, try to sexually assault her and then kill her within the span of about 30 seconds.
Right.
It seems totally outlandish. And then your book is pretty impressive with hunting down someone who basically had been missing since that trial in a lot of ways. The second witness who saw Ray Crump on the path, Lieutenant William L. Mitchell. And the guy disappears for many years and nobody can find him, but then you kind of track him down, and can you talk about how that went for a bit?
Well, when I wrote the first edition in 2012, I hadn't found Mitchell, and I thought that he was probably the likely assassin. But then someone pointed out to me through a very elaborate Google search that no, this guy was probably out in California teaching in Cal State Hayward's business school, and he was a very highly educated guy.
Having slightly changed his name to Bill Mitchell.
Right,
yeah.
From William L. Mitchell to Bill Mitchell. He legally changed his name, and of course, I took him to task on that when I finally got him in front of the deposition.
So you eventually get him in front of a deposition, and he answers, I don't recall, to just about everything, half of the questions.
Right.
And when asked why he changed his name, he can't seem to give an answer for that either.
Right.
And eventually you get his military records, which just scream that he was a part of the intelligence community, because none of them make any sense. And
Yes.
They're all over the place.
Yes, I had a lot of help with that. Roger Charles, a world-class researcher, along with his colleague Don Devereaux. They helped me immeasurably really come to terms with who Bill Mitchell really was.
So talk a little about Mary's diary, which was a big part of this.
Well, I've never seen the diary. The author who attempted to write a book about Mary allegedly had some pages of it, but I never was able to get a hold of it. The only people who did see the diary were people like James Jesus Angleton at the CIA and a couple of his colleagues. But from all the folklore around it, this is the way that Mary kept her record of what she was discovering post-Alice in that year from November '63 to her death in October '64. She wrote a lot of notes about what she had discovered. And in fact, when one CIA person who had read the diary talked to another researcher many years later, he confirmed for this guy that it was all there. All the right information, all the secrets were there in that diary.
And Ben Bradley, who was both Mary's brother-in-law, but also the managing editor of the Washington Post for
many years.
Not at that time, but
right.
for many years, yeah.
Yes.
He said in his memoir that he did go with, or was searching for the diary with Jim Angleton, right, at her house afterwards.
There's a lot of fish stories about what happened, because if you read the transcript, Bradley was in her studio the night of the murder, and I think he was there with Angleton, although he never said that. They got into her studio.
Well, he didn't say that in the transcript,
No.
right? He didn't say that in the 1965 trial,
No.
which he was put on the stand for.
Right.
Yeah, and then I found that from a psychology standpoint, I found this really fascinating, that in his memoir years later in the 90s, he claims that his sister-in-law was shot once and died instantly.
Right.
But everyone knows that's not true. She was shot twice. It lasted 30 seconds or more. She was screaming, which is what got the witness to look that direction. So I think in his, he's trying to appease his guilt by thinking, oh, she didn't suffer. But,
Right.
Yeah,
she knew she was going to die.
It's incredibly suspicious.
Yes.
We have to go to a quick break, but I'll be right back with the rest of this incredible interview. Don't change the channel. Welcome back. I'm still Lee Camp. Let's not waste any time. Here now is the rest of my interview with author Peter Janney. One document you bring forward relating to JFK's assassination that I had never heard of, and coincidentally involves your father, was this. It's notes on what they fear might come out of Jim Garrison's trial, which Jim Garrison, people might recall, was played by Kevin Costner in the movie JFK by Oliver Stone. And in this internal CIA document, they seem concerned that this trial is going to prove connection to the CIA.
Well, Clay Shaw,
Yeah.
who was being prosecuted, who claimed all through the trial that he never worked for the CIA, had nothing to do with this, at this meeting that my father was chairing in September of, I think, '67, when Shaw was building momentum, when Garrison was building momentum for this trial, they had an upper echelon meeting of which they released the minutes of. I don't know why they did, because it really is a smoking gun. Mm-hmm. But one of James Jesus Angleton's chief lieutenants, a guy named Ray Roca, comes to the meeting and basically says, Garrison's going to get a conviction at this trial, which is another way of saying, yes, Shaw was working for us, and of course we were in on it.
Right, you would only kind of be worried that this lawyer was going to prove this if there was something there to be proven. So
Right.
It seems like an admission, and coincidentally, your father was chairing the meeting.
Yes. That's a whole nother dimension of this story, Lee, in terms of my own personal journey of what I went through in order to come to the conclusion that I did, that, not only was my father leading the cover-up of the JFK assassination, or one of the cover-ups, but he was part of the conspiracy to take Mary Meyer out.
Wow.
And that final realization, we talked about this a little bit earlier before we went on air. It sent me back into my own personal therapy. I mean, I really, at that juncture, said, I just don't know whether I can do this. I don't know whether I can handle facing all of this. And luckily, I had already been in therapy years earlier with a wonderful woman who just was really great. And so I just went back and saw her for several months and snapped out of it and get the book done.
The truth is the truth.
Yeah.
Wow.
Dig it.
Your father and others, one of the key pieces that you kind of circle around and then kind of pinpoint is when they found out, or say they found out, that Mary had been killed. And it ends up kind of proving that they knew ahead of time. Can you talk about that?
Well, when you take a look at what happened and you go through the trial transcript and you see all the events that sort of were carefully put in place, you cannot come away from, I couldn't finally come away from this without seeing this was a CIA operation from start to finish. They were controlling every dimension of the murder itself, post-murder, when Crump was picked up, you know, when the policeman showed up at Bradley's house and asked him to come down to the morgue to identify the body, I mean, it was like clockwork. And it's really, you know, I think.
But it's tough to keep all those lies straight, I think, which is what ultimately slipped out, because Bradley says he found out hours before it had been publicly announced.
And he found out because my father called him and said, Ben, have you listened to the radio? And he said, Wister, I'm at work. Why would I be listening to the radio? Well, there's been a murder down on the towpath, and I'm just wondering where Mary is. You know, like my father sits around in his office at the CIA all day long listening to the radio because he has nothing better to do.
Right.
You know, I mean, it's just very, very blatant.
Yeah, it seems like they couldn't exactly keep that straight. Some of I wanted to real quick get into some of the like immediate questions that I had, that I kind of thought when I first started reading the book, which was like, well, if this was a CIA hit, why wouldn't they just do it in her sleep where they can control the environment? There's no eyewitnesses, super easy, and you know, just shot in her sleep, no one knows anything. But then you kind of realize that like if she had been going around talking to certain people about how she thought the CIA was involved in Kennedy's assassination, killing her without witnesses is very bad for them. So they need witnesses, right?
Exactly. So it was done in a very public place, and I think there was a profound amount of real engineering that went on where they were controlling the entire situation from start to finish, and it was done by professionals.
Right, and similarly, well, my next question was, this doesn't sound like, you know, when a CIA wants to kill someone, or any professional hitman wants to kill someone, you assume it can be done very quick and easy, unfortunately. How horrible is that? But this sounded so messy. You know, she was shot once, she was still alive, she's screaming, he drags her across the path, he then shoots her again. And I thought that sounds just far too messy. But then it makes sense that they needed her screaming, they needed an eyewitness to look. They wanted it to look like a sexual assault, which is not an executioner walking up and.
No, it's just a random act of violence. Yeah. You know, I mean, that was sort of the framework that they wanted to try to do this with. I think they underestimated, you know, Mary. That, you know, one shot wasn't going to take her out, and she struggled and she fought. But there was, as I point out in the book, the assassin was a very skilled assassin, and when he finally got her in the right embrace, the second shot just went right through her aorta, and that just knocked her. That was it. That was lights out.
You've talked a little about your kind of journey in writing this book. Like you talk about the other authors who had kind of tried to write this book. One of them ultimately decided not to after getting deep within it because he said he wanted to live. You know, who knows what kind of threats were made to him. And then the other one is Leo D'Amour, who's well known for the book about the cover-up of Chappaquiddick with Ted Kennedy.
Senatorial Privilege is the name of that book.
Yeah, Senatorial Privilege. And D'Amour gets, you know, years and years into researching and writing this, and then ultimately kills himself after becoming more and more paranoid about, you know, rightfully so, about being watched or possibly followed and stuff like that. Just talk about that, and talk about how that weighed on you while you were writing this. I mean, what were you?
When I found out Leo D'Amour was taking this topic on, I think it was like probably the late 1980s, maybe very early 1990. I went out of my way to contact him and introduce myself. And he knew who my father was immediately, because he said, "Oh, your father was one of the pallbearers at the funeral." And I said, "Yes, that's right." And you know, I knew the family very well. I grew up with, you know, one of the sons who was my best friend, who was hit by a car and killed. And so I befriended Leo D'Amour, and we had a couple of years where we would talk sometimes, you know, twice a month. I would go down to his place in Connecticut. We'd do interviews. And he really had painstakingly started to put this together. He was just having finished his book about Ted Kennedy and Chappaquiddick, he went right into researching this book. He befriended the attorney, Dovey Roundtree, who started confiding to him all the, little nasty things that were going on during the trial, and these phone calls that she would get late at night with people just breathing on the phone, but, not really saying anything. They were obviously trying to intimidate her and scare her. But then something happened with Leo, and I don't have proof of it, but I think he complained of being poisoned. And I think, someone might have slipped him a Mickey, so to speak. The CIA had a whole department run by this guy, Sidney Gottlieb, who created all these substances, all these poisons to take people out. He wanted to do it for Castro. He did it for another individual that I talk about, in the book. So, I don't think it's far-fetched, and I have to live in conspiracy land to believe that, someone got to Damore, and as one famous ex-CIA person said, it's easy to commit a murder, but it takes a lot of expertise to know how to commit a suicide.
God, how horrible is that?
Yeah.
That's incredible. So this last question, maybe the hardest one. Do you feel anything's changed with the unaccountability of our intelligence community? And I mean, if there's one thing you get out of this book, it's that they felt like they just ruled the world. They didn't have to worry even about elected officials getting in their way. They could deal with them. And, you talk about how Cord Meyer was in charge of a project called Operation Mockingbird that I've talked about on my show before, which was to insert CIA into various news organizations so they always could get good coverage, whatever coverage they needed at a time.
Right.
And nowadays, that program's not around anymore, but nowadays, you don't have to do it secretly.
Right.
Our mainstream media just says, here's our CIA correspondent, and they just fawn over their every word. So it's no longer a secret program. So are things worse than they were? Or?
I would say they're worse in some ways, but they're better in the sense that people are waking up. There is an awakening in our culture. I mean, when you have over 80% of the population, I think the last piece of work, research done on this, believing that they did not think the Warren Commission was truthful, that they believed that there was a conspiracy in the death of a sitting president. I think, that's what it takes. And it's shows like yours and others that really serve to help educate anyone who's willing to listen to really understand what their government is truly up to. And so, I mean, in this day and age, we live in the surveillance age. We have whistleblowers like Ed Snowden, who really, try and do the right thing. John Kiriakou, who we talked about earlier.
Yeah.
I mean, there are a number of them now who are coming forward, but this is what it's going to take.
Yeah, courage is contagious.
Courage is contagious, and it's very, very necessary.
Well, thank you so much, Peter. The book is Mary's Mosaic, The CIA Conspiracy to Murder JFK, Mary Pinchot Meyer, and Their Vision for World Peace. Thank you so much. I highly recommend it. We couldn't get to half of what's in there, but
well,
great job.
A lot of people tell me the book reads like a novel, so I think many in your audience will find it a valuable read.
Thanks again.
All right, man.
That's the show. And although there won't be a new Redacted Tonight this week because of the holiday, I have new web-exclusive videos for you at youtube.com/Redacted Tonight. Go check them out there. Also, my new book is available for pre-sale at leecampbook.com. It has an intro by Jimmy Dore and a foreword by Chris Hedges. Do not miss it. Until next time, good night and keep fighting.